Hello, I'm Julia Schulteis with the Transnational NGO Initiative here at Maxwell, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Werner Schleiffer. Dr. Schleiffer has over 3 decades of experience in international development, including work with the World Food Program, as well as CoNGO, the Conference of NGOs, and Consultative Relationship with the United Nations. Dr. Schleiffer, thank you so much for taking time to sit down with us today. This will be a beneficial resource for students and faculty here at Maxwell.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. All right. I'd like to start off with hearing a brief overview of your extensive career in the humanitarian field.
Well, I started out with the United Nations Development Program in Afghanistan, essentially focusing on the first population census, then international air traffic across Afghanistan, and measures in support of Afghanistan's foreign trade. And then I moved over to WFP, and I liked very much working for WFP because it was one of the very few organizations that covered operations all over Afghanistan and was not just located with its operations in the capital. And then after Afghanistan, while the situation in Afghanistan, the security situation deteriorated enormously. During my time, there were 3 coups d'etats, some of them really very bloody, killing a lot of people. And then there was also the Soviet invasion. And the consequence of the Soviet invasion was easily, that's probably conservative estimate, something like 200,000 people killed. And at that time, the Vietnamese armed forces had occupied Cambodia, but at least there was a point of entry, and there was the beginning of an opportunity to save lives in Cambodia. When I arrived there, there was 1 architect left, 44 medical doctors, an enormous quantum of destruction. It was a country that was forced to start from scratch. I can hardly think of any country that suffered as much since World War II as Cambodians. And the idea was, first of all, to bring in food. But bringing in food was not enough. I had to bring in 1,041 trucks. I forgot between 6 and 8 million liters of fuel for the trucks. Have the river, the Mekong, dredged so that the ocean-going vessels could go up to Phnom Penh. Have the piers rehabilitated. One of the first things I did is bring in a plane with 22 tons of paper and pencils and little calculators, because all this didn't exist. My office furniture, desks and chairs, everything had to be imported to be operational very quickly. And well, this is where I started out with. And because of these extraordinary living conditions, tough conditions, I was supposed to stay there for 3 months. But how can you leave a country when every night before the curfew, you walk home and you see people dying in front of you in the streets? I simply couldn't do this. And so consequently, every 3 months, I send a message to WFP headquarters saying, I can swing it for another 3 months. And the first year wasn't even over. I was the longest serving UN official in Cambodia. But it was important and it was worth it. And in the end, I stayed nearly 3 years, up to a point where there were the first small agricultural exports out of Cambodia. And then I thought, okay, now I've done my job, now I can go. And then I was reassigned to WFP headquarters. And my second job in headquarters was to be the focal point for humanitarian, for emergency operations in 3 areas. One of them being Indochina and Thailand, and the other one, Afghan refugees in Pakistan and Iran, and of course the operations within Afghanistan. And the third one that was in the mid-80s, during the years of the so-called Great Drought that affected the Sudano-Sahelian belt in Northern Africa, all the way from Ethiopia, Djibouti, all the way to the west to Senegal. So I had this experience first at the country level, then at the level of backstopping from headquarters. That involved a lot of traveling. I traveled to some 45 countries there, because it was not just a matter of getting the food distributed within the countries to the right people at the right time, but the logistics had to work as well. The particularities of food is that it has a volume and it has only a certain lifespan. So you need a well-functioning, well-oiled logistics machinery to get these huge quantities to the beneficiaries, but also to be on time, to be fast. In other words, working for WFP means, well, it's 5 o'clock, you go home. That is a no-no. You go home when the job is done. And my third group of assignments was then, I was the director of the WFP offices in Geneva and then in Brussels. And there were essentially two components of my work, or three, I should say. One was with the other UN agencies, international organizations, to set up packages of aid. Food aid alone is not enough. There has to be health care, there has to be basic education, all kinds of inputs that help people to become again independent. The second aspect was to work with the donor community. And the third part was to be a kind of spokesman for WFP. Talk to the media, newspapers, television channels, and make them aware of what was going on and the operations that had to be successfully completed. So this is perhaps it's a bit lengthy, but this is a bit of an overview of what I've done in humanitarian operations.
I know it's difficult to ask for a brief overview when you have such an amazing experience. And I have so many more questions now, given that, but we'll stick with the career interview questions here today. So what did motivate your career in the humanitarian field, and even going back to your educational experience and your choices?
Well, I wanted to study right from the beginning economics. But not what cost curves and demand curves. That's okay, that's the beginning of the whole thing. But my fields of specialization for the PhD program were development economics and labor economics. And development economics in particular, that hardly existed at European universities. It was a new field. At the time when more and more countries became independent. And I had the feeling that very little existed at that time in terms of academic material, but it was an area where there was an enormous potential. I wanted to go away where I could discover things, new territory, and not go paths where so many others had been working on. And of course, linked very much to development economics is also labor economics. Labor force participation rate, wages, and let's say labor movements, the whole issue of decent income, decent wages, that came up gradually in those years, and so I thought these are areas I really want to focus on that were not in the mainstream, but that I felt the way the political evolution of the world was going, that had a very good potential. And that's why I really started out with those fields.
And economics.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Oh, great. So with the humanitarian field, there are...
Well, and I feel, being a German citizen, I felt that Germany had done a lot of harm worldwide. And it was the responsibility of my generation to create and work on an image of Germany that was a new image there was a country that contributed, that a country that helped, and not a country that destroyed. And lay the foundation for my generation, but also for future generations. Somebody had to do the job and had to start with this kind of an approach so that future generations of Germans could build on that. And that's why it was very important for me to work abroad and to contribute, to be, let's say, a proactive player and get allies in this kind of an undertaking to not only to learn from the past, but also to set new foundations, be it through foreign affairs or be it through UN agencies. And I must say, my time when I started with the UN, there were very few Germans around. And also for very practical reasons, there were very few Germans who were both fluent in English and French. And I'd also studied at French University, got a master's at a French university, and that of course then was helpful as well. But it was very important to me to to be a little element in something that was to be a new Germany with a new vision, a constructive vision.
Well, you did certainly set an example. Given the humanitarian field, it faces such a number of great challenges. What are some of the biggest challenges that you do face when going into that type of work, and what are the attitudes and approaches needed to overcome those?
Well, first of all, you have so many different humanitarian situations, depending on whether the government, the host government, is on your side or not, whether there is a civil war that is used by the host government in order to destroy or ruin other parts of the society. But then there are also emergencies, drought, for example, a very slow process, but where actors have failed to foresee that, and consequently did not come with the remedies in time. So essentially you have, I would make a distinction between what's usually called man-made disasters and natural disasters. How do you deal with that? Natural disasters, it is very important to have a consensus among aid agencies, be they of governments or the UN system and NGOs, to bind them all in to provide a package deal. And in those cases, normally it's at the request of host governments, and very often they also play a very supportive role. The other issue in the case of what's traditionally called man-made disasters, where you have civil wars, or wars from the outside, but in most cases in the world we do have warfare is essentially a civil warfare. And there you have to figure out who is going to give me support. Is it the government? But then we very often make the mistake, we talk about the government of country X, Y, or Z. In reality, that doesn't exist. There are departments that are on your side and others that are not on your side. And how can you get the support of those that are on your side and not only support you to carry out your mission, to bring in your aid, but also convince the others to be supportive? And I must say, even in the most terrible situations, even I've been dealing with colonels and God knows what in the Pol Pot group that were mass murderers, but I had to get them on my side. So you need patience. You have to be able to tell them, look, these are the benefits of what I'd like to do. But the other thing is also to be very humble and in a certain way really try to show that you express respect for the country, respect for its cultural heritage, respect for its people. And you have to be outgoing, an extrovert. But if you say, well, just a bit jokingly, oh, there I've made a terrible boo-boo. So for them, in a certain way, this is quite a shock, but in a positive sense, because they originally see you as, well, this foreign quote-unquote master, but the moment you show that you're quite a very normal human being and that you make boo-boos as well, then in a certain way you open the doors and you elicit a certain sympathetic approach. And this is something to build on. And then, of course, what is very important, learn the local language. Nobody says that you have to know it fluently, but if you can carry on a simple conversation, then you also open the hearts and the minds of people, and of those that need the help, but just as well of those in the government and at the official level. I hope I answered your question.
You did. Yeah. That's great. And this will be our last question for the day, but what career advice do you have for students who are looking to go into the humanitarian field, and what skills do you think that they should work to develop?
Well, okay, they should be extroverts. They should be willing to learn foreign languages, keeping in mind that they will never learn them fluently, but a vocabulary of 200, 300 words works wonder sometimes. You need a certain compassion. How can I help people? But not just help them, what can I do so that they can stand on their own feet? And you have to be prepared to work with like-minded people. Be they people of those countries, be they of other UN organizations, governments, NGOs, but you have, and this is an everyday working process that is never completed. How can I produce a package with the input, with the assistance of others, like-minded people? There are ups and downs, and sometimes you live in, you're exposed to the threat of death. But there are also those extreme situations. But you, in the end, when you see that people appreciate what you're doing, and when you see that little children, they have probably a much better life ahead of them than their parents, when you see that little businesses are cropping up again, then I think this is one of the highest levels of satisfaction you can get. Just to give you a little anecdote, I was dealing in Cambodia with people in the Ministry of Transport, and one of them came up one day and said, "You're the mother of Cambodia." And I said, "What?" I said, "Well, you bring the food like a mother, and you help us survive." And this is something you cannot forget. It sticks with you for the rest of your life. But then that is an indication that you have a job done to help so many people to live, as I said, in dignity. That is the most important thing.
Wow. Well, I think going into the humanitarian field is not just a career, but a life. And it's so important, as you mentioned, to remain humble. Remember that we're all human beings, and most importantly, to listen to the communities and the people that you're working with. So, that concludes our career interview. Dr. Schleiffer, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
It was a big pleasure for me also to convey my experience. I consider it my duty and the duty of my generation to convey all this knowledge and experience to the next generations, to make their life easier, and perhaps to encourage a number of them to follow those kind of footsteps.
Yes. Thank you
very much.
again.
Thank you.